Could the most powerful jet engine ever built actually lose a fight to a smaller, quieter rival that almost nobody talks about? That's the question we're settling today. On one side, a giant so massive that its front fan is wider than the body of an entire passenger jet. On the other, an engine that doesn't care about brute force at all because it was built to win a completely different war. Two philosophies, two manufacturers, two visions of what flight is even supposed to be. One of them holds a Guinness World Record. The other powers 9 out of the 10 most profitable airlines on Earth. So which one actually wins? Stick with me, because the answer is not the one you think. In this corner, we have the GE9X. This is the heavyweight, the big one. The engine General Electric built specifically for the Boeing 777X. And the numbers on this thing are almost hard to believe, so let me walk you through them slowly, because I want them to actually land. The fan at the front measures 134 inches across. That's about 3.5 meters, 11 feet. Stop and picture that for a second. The spinning fan you'd see if you stood directly in front of this engine is wider than the entire fuselage of a Boeing 737. Let that sink in. A whole narrow-body airliner, the kind you've probably flown on dozens of times, the kind that seats well over 100 people, is narrower than just the front fan of this single engine. That's not me exaggerating for views. That's the literal measurement. The tube you sit in on a typical short flight would fit inside the opening of this one engine. And it's not just the fan that's enormous. The entire nacelle, the outer casing that wraps around the engine, is about 184 inches wide, which is over 4.5 meters across. That means the whole engine unit is wider than the cabin of many of the planes flying around you at any given airport. When a 777X taxis past a terminal window, people instinctively stare at the massive 64-meter wingspan and those dramatic folding wingtips. But honestly, the true giant on that aircraft is sitting quietly underneath the wing. The engines are the real monsters of the machine. It's the largest commercial jet engine ever built. Full stop. Nothing else hanging off the wing of a passenger plane comes anywhere close. And here's the thing, it didn't just appear out of nowhere. The GE9X is the descendant of another legend, the GE90, the engine that powered the Boeing 777 for decades and was itself the largest engine in the world until its own child came along and took the crown. The GE90's biggest variant had a fan of 128 inches. The GE9X pushed that out another 6 inches to 134. When the GE9X officially surpassed it back in January 2020, it ended the GE90's long reign as the king of the skies. So this isn't just a big engine. It's the current champion of a dynasty, the latest and largest in a bloodline of giants. But it doesn't just look intimidating sitting there. Let me tell you what happened on November 10th, 2017, at GE's outdoor test facility in Peebles, Ohio. Engineers strapped one of these engines down and decided to find out what it could really do. They ran it at what's called triple red line conditions. Now, every engine has limits, red lines you're never supposed to cross in normal operation. Maximum fan speed, maximum core speed, maximum exhaust gas temperature. In a real flight, you'd never push all three to the absolute edge at the same time. But in this test, that's exactly what they did. Everything cranked to the breaking point, simultaneously, on purpose. The engine hit 134,300 pounds of thrust. Guinness World Records made it official. The GE9X became the most powerful commercial aircraft jet engine ever tested, breaking the previous record of 127,900 pounds that had been held by, you guessed it, the GE90 since 2002. So GE didn't just break the world record. They broke their own world record with the successor to the very engine that set it. And to give you a sense of just how much force 134,300 pounds of thrust really is, consider this. That figure isn't too far off from the thrust of the Soyuz rocket, the rocket that carried Yuri Gagarin into orbit and made him the first human being in space. Read that again. We are talking about a commercial jet engine, the kind bolted to a passenger plane that flirts with the kind of power we associate with launching humans off the planet. That's the company this engine keeps. Now here's a detail that I think is genuinely wild, and it tells you something important about this whole matchup. In normal everyday service, the GE9X is certified at around 110,000 pounds of thrust. So that record-shattering 134,300 figure? That was the engine flexing, showing off in a test cell. The version that actually flies the 777X holds back, with enormous headroom that airlines will basically never need to touch. The engine is so overbuilt that its everyday cruising power is tens of thousands of pounds below what it's proven it can do. That's not waste. That's margin. That's an engine that will spend its entire life never breaking a sweat. And speaking of proving itself, I have to tell you about what these engines go through before they're ever allowed near a paying passenger. Because the certification testing for the GE9X reads like a torture manual, and it's honestly one of the most underappreciated parts of aviation. To get certified, GE didn't just run the engine and call it a day. They deliberately broke it, over and over, in controlled and terrifying ways, to prove it could survive the worst. They ran what's called a blade-out test, where they intentionally separate a single fan blade from the spinning hub at takeoff thrust, on purpose, to make sure that if a blade ever did let go in real life, the engine would contain the damage and not tear itself or the wing apart. Imagine deliberately detonating a piece off the most powerful jet engine ever built while it's screaming at full power, just to confirm it won't kill anyone. They ran endurance tests with the rotors deliberately knocked out of balance, so the whole engine would shake violently at the maximum vibration limits allowed in service, a requirement to earn the long-range certification that lets twin-engine jets fly far out over oceans. They ran ingestion tests, feeding objects into the engine to see what it could swallow and survive. They ran crosswind tests, icing tests in the brutal cold of Winnipeg, Manitoba, and over-temperature tests where they cooked the turbine hotter than it should ever get. Across the whole program, GE used 8 separate development engines, each one assigned to a different flavor of abuse, mostly out at that facility in Peebles, Ohio. The whole thing took years. The first GE9X ran on the ground back in April 2016. It first flew, mounted on a flying test bed, on March 13, 2018. It powered the 777X's maiden flight in early 2020, and it finally received its FAA type certificate on September 25, 2020. GE poured more than $2 billion into developing this engine. $2 billion. That's the price of admission to build the biggest engine the world has ever seen, and to prove, beyond any doubt, that it's safe. When you understand everything one of these engines survives before it carries its first passenger, that 134, 300-pound record stops looking like a stunt and starts looking like the tip of an enormous iceberg of engineering. So that's our giant, the strongman, the record holder. The largest commercial engine ever to turn a blade, forged through years of deliberate punishment and $2 billion of ambition. And if this video were a contest about raw, naked power, we could roll the credits right here. The GE9X would walk away undefeated, but it's not a contest about raw power. And that, my friend, is exactly where this gets interesting. Because in the other corner, there's an engine that looks at all of that, all those records and all that mass, and basically just shrugs. Meet the Rolls-Royce Trent XWB. This is the engine that powers the Airbus A350. And here's the first thing you need to understand about it. Rolls-Royce doesn't call it the biggest. They don't call it the most powerful. They never have. They call it something completely different. They call it the world's most efficient large aero engine in service. Read that line again, because it's the whole battle in a single phrase. Most efficient. Not most powerful. Not biggest. Most efficient. That's the entire pitch, and it's a pitch aimed at a completely different target than the one the GE9X is shooting at. The Trent XWB is, on paper, the smaller engine. Its fan is 118 inches across, 3 meters, compared to the GE9X's 134 inches. Its most powerful version, the Trent XWB 97, produces 97,000 pounds of thrust. Now, don't get me wrong, 97,000 pounds is a colossal amount of force. It's the highest thrust of any Rolls-Royce Trent engine ever made, and the Trent family goes back to the early 1990s. But even at its mightiest, the Trent XWB still falls well short of what the GE9X can throw down. In a pure arm wrestling match, the Trent loses, and it loses clearly. But before you write it off, let me give you a couple of numbers about this engine that I think are genuinely poetic, because they show that smaller absolutely does not mean gentle. At takeoff, the Trent XWB swallows around 1,440 kilograms of air every single second. Every second. That's well over a ton of air being inhaled, compressed, and blasted out the back, 60 times a minute. And the forces on those spinning fan blades are almost incomprehensible. Rolls-Royce has described the load on each fan blade at takeoff as comparable to having a freight train hanging off of it. A freight train on each blade, while it spins thousands of times per minute. So no, this engine is not delicate. It's a controlled explosion wearing a very polite British accent. there's also a real history here worth knowing. The Trent XWB was selected to exclusively power the A350 back in July 2006. The first engine ran on a testbed in June 2010. It first took to the sky bolted to a flying testbed, an Airbus A380 of all things, in February 2012. And the very first production Trent XWB 84 engines were delivered in 2014, destined for the very first A350 to enter airline service, which went to Qatar Airways. The XWB 84 entered commercial service in early 2015. So while the GE9X is the newer arrival, the Trent XWB has now been quietly racking up years of real-world service, proving itself on routes all over the planet. And the market noticed. The Trent XWB became the fastest-selling wide-body engine in history, with well over 1,600 units sold. When an engine sells like that, it's not because of marketing. It's because the airlines ran the numbers and the numbers worked. But muscle was never the point. And to understand why, you have to understand what airlines on this planet actually care about. Because here's the truth that most people staring out a terminal window never stop to think about. Airlines do not really care which engine is the strongest. They care which engine costs them the least to drag across an ocean every single day. For 20, 25, sometimes 30 years. That is the number that keeps an airline alive or drives it into bankruptcy. Think about it from their side of the desk for a second. When an airline orders a new fleet, they're not buying an engine for one flight. They're committing to fly that exact engine several times a day for decades. They will buy the fuel for it, pay to maintain it, and live with its quirks for longer than most people stay in a single job. So when they evaluate an engine, the headline thrust number barely registers. What they're really staring at is a lifetime cost, stretched out over millions of miles. A slightly stronger engine that drinks more fuel is, to them, a slow financial leak that never stops. A slightly weaker engine that sips fuel is a quiet, compounding gift that pays them back every single flight for 30 years. Given that math, you can probably already guess which philosophy most of them lean toward. And that, my friend, is a completely different fight than the one the GE9X was built to win. The giant trained for a strongman competition. The Trent trained for a marathon. And as you're about to see, those are two very different kinds of athlete. If you're enjoying this breakdown so far, do me a quick favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. Now, before we throw these two into the ring, let me make sure we're all on the same page about how one of these things even works, because once you understand it, every round that follows is going to hit so much harder. And don't worry, I'm going to keep this simple. A modern jet engine like these two is what's called a high bypass turbofan. And the whole thing really comes down to 4 basic moves, which engineers sometimes summarize as suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Stay with me. First, suck. That giant fan at the front, the part you can see, pulls in an enormous amount of air. Second, squeeze. Some of that air gets funneled into the core of the engine, where a series of compressors crush it into a much smaller, much higher pressure volume. By the time air reaches the end of the high-pressure compressor in one of these engines, it's been squeezed dozens of times over. The GE9X reaches that astonishing 60-to-1 overall pressure ratio, the Trent XWB around 50-to-1. Third, bang. That super-compressed air gets mixed with fuel in the combustor and ignited, and the temperatures in there are mind-bending, climbing past 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt most metals, which is exactly why those ceramic materials matter so much. Fourth, blow. All that hot, expanding gas rushes out the back through a set of turbines, which spin like windmills in the blast. And here's the clever loop. Those spinning turbines are connected by shafts back to the compressors and the fan at the front, so the engine, once it's running, powers its own air sucking and squeezing. It's a self-sustaining hurricane. But here's the part that's the real key to both of these engines, and it's hiding in that word bypass. In a high bypass turbofan, only a small fraction of the air the fan pulls in actually goes through that hot, fuel-burning core. The vast majority of it, the bypass air, skips the core entirely and just gets accelerated by that big front fan and blown straight out the back around the outside of the engine. In the GE9X, with its roughly 10-to-1 bypass ratio, about 9 out of every 10 units of air, the fan moves never touch the burning core at all. They're just pushed back by the fan, cold and efficient. Why does that matter so much? Because it turns out that moving a huge amount of air relatively gently is far more fuel efficient than blasting a small amount of air violently. That's the entire secret of the modern airliner engine. The bigger and more efficient the fan, the more of your thrust comes from that gentle, cold bypass air, and the less fuel you burn for the same push. This single principle, move more air, more gently, is the thread connecting almost everything we're about to compare. The GE9X chases it with sheer size. The Trent XWB chases it with refinement. Same goal, different roads. Now that you can see the machinery turning in your head, let's get to the rounds. Round 1. Size and power. This one's almost unfair, so let's get it out of the way fast and honestly. The GE9X wins. It's not close. It's not even in the same area code as close. Bigger fan, more thrust, the world record, the headlines, the jaw drop factor. When you need to lift a Boeing 777X off a runway, and that aircraft can tip the scales at more than 350 tons at takeoff, you need monstrous, overwhelming power. And the GE9X serves it up without flinching. Here's a detail that makes this even more striking. The 777X is the largest twin-engine passenger aircraft ever developed. Twin engine. That means just 2 of these giants, and only 2 have to haul that entire aircraft, fully loaded with passengers and cargo and a staggering amount of fuel, off the ground and across the widest oceans in the world. There's no 3rd or 4th engine to share the load, just a pair of GE9Xs doing all of it. That's why the engine had to be a monster. There was simply no other way to move that much airplane with so few engines. And think about what that 2-engine design demands in terms of trust. For most of aviation history, crossing a vast ocean meant flying a 3 or 4-engine aircraft, partly for the reassurance of redundancy. The whole reason we can now confidently send a twin-engine jet thousands of miles out over open water, hours from the nearest runway, is that each individual engine has become so absurdly reliable and so overwhelmingly powerful that 2 of them are more than enough, even if one were to fail. The GE9X is a direct product of that trust. Its enormous power margin, that gap between its 110,000 pound everyday rating and its 134, 300 pound proven maximum, is part of what makes flying a twin across the Pacific not just possible, but routine. The giant isn't just strong for show. It's strong because that strength is what buys an entire ocean of safety margin. So round 1 goes to the giant, decisively. But do not get comfortable, because the very next round flips this entire fight on its head. Round 2. Efficiency. Now the tables don't just turn, they flip completely over. Rolls-Royce designed the Trent XWB and the Airbus A350 together, hand in hand, as what they like to call perfect partners. This is a key point. The engine and the airframe weren't developed separately and then bolted together. They were optimized for each other from the very first day. The wing shaped around the engine tuned for the wing. And the payoff of all that integration is a combination that delivers up to 25% lower fuel burn and CO2 emissions compared to the previous generation of aircraft it replaced. 25%. I need you to really sit with what that number means in the real world, because on a slide it just looks like a statistic. But in an airline's accounting department, it's an earthquake. A wide-body jet might stay in service for 25, even 30 years. On a single long-haul flight, it burns through an enormous quantity of fuel, tens of thousands of pounds of it. Now multiply that by every flight, every single day, across an entire fleet of dozens of aircraft, across decades of operation. A 25% improvement in fuel burn isn't a rounding error. It's frequently the entire difference between a route making money and a route bleeding it. It can be the deciding factor in whether an airline orders 50 aircraft or 0. And here's the number that, to me, tells the whole story. Rolls-Royce says the Trent XWB 84, the version powering the A350-900, has been chosen by 9 out of the 10 most profitable airlines in the world. 9 out of 10. The single most commercially successful airlines on the planet. The ones whose entire existence depends on squeezing profit out of brutally thin margins, looked at every option available to them and kept landing on this one engine. Let me put the fuel math into terms you can actually feel, because 25% can wash over you if you're not careful. Jet fuel is one of the single largest costs an airline has, often the biggest expense on the whole spreadsheet, sometimes rivaling what they spend on their entire workforce. When fuel prices spike, airlines that were profitable can suddenly start hemorrhaging money. So an engine that burns a quarter less fuel isn't offering a modest perk. It's offering survival insurance. It's the difference between weathering a fuel price spike and getting crushed by one. And it scales in a way that's almost hard to comprehend. A single wide-body on a long route might burn through the rough equivalent of a small swimming pool's worth of fuel on one flight. Now imagine an airline flying dozens of these aircraft, each doing 1 or 2 long-haul flights a day, every day, for decades. Shave 25% off the fuel burn across all of that, and you're not talking about saving a few dollars. You're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars over the life of a fleet. That's money that can go into new aircraft, into lower ticket prices, into staying alive when a competitor folds. This is why airline executives, people who think in spreadsheets and decades, get genuinely emotional about a single-digit efficiency gain. To them, efficiency isn't boring. Efficiency is everything. That is not luck. That is not marketing. That is efficiency winning in the only arena that ultimately matters to the people writing the checks, the balance sheet. Round 2 goes decisively, emphatically, to the Trent XWB. So now we're tied, 1-1. And this is the moment where a lot of people would just throw up their hands and say, well, they're different engines. You can't really compare them. It's apples and oranges. But that's the lazy way out. Because the deeper you dig into the actual engineering choices behind these two machines, the more you realize they're telling two completely different stories about how to chase greatness. And those stories are fascinating. So let's keep going. Round 3. The technology hidden under the cowling. This is where it gets nerdy, in the best possible way. So stay with me, because I'm going to make this make sense even if you've never touched an engine in your life. The GE9X and the Trent XWB don't just differ in size. They're built on fundamentally different skeletons. And I mean that literally, all the way down to how the spinning parts are arranged inside the core. Let's start with the Trent. Rolls-Royce has a signature, something they've been famous for since the 1970s, the 3-shaft design. Now, most big jet engines, including the GE9X, use a 2-shaft layout. Here's the simplest way I can explain the difference without burying you in jargon. A jet engine has several major rotating sections, and each one has a speed at which it works most efficiently. The problem is, those ideal speeds aren't the same for every section. A 2-shaft engine has to force some of those sections to share a shaft, which means at least one of them is always running at a compromise speed, not its perfect speed. A 3-shaft engine solves that by giving the fan, the intermediate pressure compressor, and the high pressure compressor each their own dedicated shaft. So each one can spin at exactly the speed that's best for it, independently. Think of it like the gears on a bicycle. A bike with more gears lets you always be in exactly the right one for the hill you're climbing or the flat you're cruising. You're never stuck grinding in a gear that's wrong for the moment. That's what 3 shafts buy you, precision across every phase of flight. The catch is that it's more complex, heavier in terms of engineering effort, and genuinely harder to build well. That's a big part of why almost nobody else in the industry does it. But Rolls-Royce has spent half a century mastering this exact architecture, and it's one of the core reasons the Trent XWB SIPs fuel the way it does. In the XWB, that fan is driven by a 6-stage turbine, the intermediate compressor has 8 stages, and the whole thing is wrapped in decades of refinement. Now let's cross over to the GE9X, because GE took a totally different road to the same destination of greatness. Instead of chasing elegance through extra shafts, GE threw the absolute bleeding edge of materials science at the problem. Deep inside the hottest region of the engine, the place right behind the combustor where temperatures climb high enough to melt ordinary metals, the GE9X uses something called ceramic matrix composites. These are advanced materials, lighter than the metal alloys they replace, and able to survive savage heat while needing far less cooling air to keep them alive. Now, why does cooling air matter so much? Here's the elegant part. In a jet engine, you have to bleed off some of your air just to cool the hottest components and stop them from cooking themselves. But every molecule of air you spend on cooling is a molecule you can't use to make thrust or save fuel. So if a new material lets you cool less, you suddenly free up air to do useful work. The ceramics in the GE9X let GE run the engine at an overall pressure ratio of 60-1, which is genuinely extraordinary for a commercial engine. And that high pressure ratio translates directly into efficiency that a traditional all-metal engine simply could not reach. The ceramics didn't just make the engine tougher, they unlocked a whole new level of performance. And then there's the fan itself, which hides one of my favorite engineering surprises in all of modern aviation. The GE9X has just 16 fan blades. 16. Now compare that to its own predecessor, the GE90, which had 22 blades. Sit with that for a second, because it's counterintuitive in the best way. The engine got bigger. It got more powerful. It set a world record. And yet the number of fan blades went down. How? The answer is that each individual blade got so much better. Those 16 blades are made from 4th-generation carbon fiber composite, and each one is now so advanced, so strong, and so aerodynamically refined that it can do the work that used to require more blades. And fewer blades isn't just a fun fact. Fewer blades means less weight. It means cleaner airflow through the fan. It means a fan that can spin in a way that's simultaneously quieter and more efficient. The leading edges are reinforced to survive bird strikes, the trailing edges are tuned for flexibility, and the whole fan case is composite too, to keep weight down. It's a masterclass in doing more with less. And you can actually trace this evolution like a story across 3 generations of GE engines. The original GE90 used 22 fan blades. The smaller, more modern GEnx that came along for the Boeing 787 and 747-8 dropped to 18. And now the GE9X, the biggest of them all, uses just 16. Read that progression again, because it's genuinely beautiful. As the engineering got smarter, the engines got more powerful while needing fewer and fewer blades. Each blade carries more of the load than ever before. That declining blade count is, in a very real sense, a graph of human cleverness improving over decades. Every blade they removed represents a problem they solved. There's a similar story buried in those pressure ratios I mentioned. The GE9X hits an overall pressure ratio of 60-1, the Trent XWB around 50-1. Here's why that number is one of the most important in the whole engine. The more you compress the air before you burn it, the more energy you extract from every drop of fuel. Higher pressure ratio means better thermal efficiency, which means less fuel burned for the same thrust. But there's a catch, and it's a brutal one. Squeezing air that hard makes it ferociously hot, and burning it makes the core hotter still. Push the pressure ratio up, and you push the temperatures up, right to the edge of what materials can survive. That's the wall every engine designer slams into. And it's exactly why the GE9X's ceramic matrix composites are such a big deal. By surviving heat that would destroy ordinary metal, those ceramics let GE push the pressure ratio higher than anyone else, which is a huge part of why it can be both the biggest engine and a remarkably efficient one. The materials didn't just make it tough, they tore down the wall that was holding efficiency back. So who wins round 3? Honestly, this one is a draw. And it's a beautiful, satisfying draw. The Trent XWB wins on architectural elegance. That 3-shaft layout is a genuine engineering marvel that almost no one else can pull off. The GE9X wins on raw materials innovation. Those ceramic matrix composites and that 60-1 pressure ratio are pushing right up against the limits of what physics currently allows. They're both brilliant. They just chose different roads to get to brilliant. One went through clever architecture. The other went through exotic materials. Neither is wrong. Both are stunning. We're still tied, 1-1, with a draw in the middle. So before we get to the round that decides everything, let's run a few more, because there's a whole side to this fight that the spec sheets never show you. Round 4, the Bloodlines. Before you can really judge these two engines, you have to know where they came from, because neither one of them was born in a vacuum. They're both the latest chapter in long, storied family histories, and those histories shaped everything about who they are. Let's trace the giant's lineage first. The GE9X didn't spring out of nowhere. Its DNA runs straight back through the GE90, the engine that defined the Boeing 777 for an entire generation. The GE90 first entered service all the way back in November 1995 with British Airways, and for years it was the undisputed king. The GE90 115B variant held the thrust world record from 2002, the very record the GE9X would eventually break. The GE90 became the exclusive engine of the longest, heaviest 777 variants, the 777, 300ER, and the ultra-long-range 777-200LR. And here's a fun piece of history. Back in November 2005, a GE90-powered 777-200LR flew the longest flight ever by a commercial airliner at the time, going from Hong Kong to London the long way, over the Pacific, across the United States, and over the Atlantic, more than 21,000 kilometers in over 22 hours. So efficiency and endurance were already in this family's blood. The GE9X took all of that heritage, all those decades of lessons, and scaled it up with new materials and a bigger fan. When General Electric announced studies on the GE9X back in February 2012, the goal was simple: build a derivative that was about 10% more fuel efficient than the GE90. And they delivered exactly that. Now the Trent's bloodline, which is just as rich. The Rolls-Royce Trent is a whole family of engines, and the name itself is a piece of history, named after the River Trent in England, continuing a Rolls-Royce tradition of naming engines after rivers. The Trent architecture traces back to the legendary RB211 of the 1970s, the engine that first brought that famous three-shaft design to the world. From that root grew an entire dynasty. The Trent 700 for the Airbus A330, the Trent 800 for the Boeing 777, the Trent 900 for the Airbus A380 Super Jumbo, the Trent 1000 for the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, and finally, the Trent XWB for the Airbus A350. The XWB, by the way, stands for Extra Wide Body, which is the same designation Airbus uses for the A350 itself. The Trent XWB is the sixth generation of this engine family, and it represents everything Rolls-Royce learned across decades of building three-shaft turbofans distilled into one purpose-built machine. It's the most powerful Trent ever made. So who wins the bloodline round? I'm calling this one a draw too, because both families are aviation royalty. The GE90 dynasty gave us the most powerful engines in history and some of the longest flights ever flown. The Trent dynasty gave us the engines that power nearly every major wide-body Airbus and the Boeing 787. You genuinely cannot tell the story of modern wide-body aviation without both of these family trees. They are the two great houses of the jet age. Still tied. Let's keep swinging. Round 5. Noise and the environment. Here's a battleground that didn't matter nearly as much a few decades ago, but today it can decide whether an airline can even operate certain routes at certain hours. Airports around the world have strict noise limits, and some of the most valuable airports impose curfews and penalties on aircraft that are too loud. So quietness isn't just a courtesy to people living near runways. It's hard cash and operational freedom. And here's where physics does something interesting that connects back to size. Remember the GE9X's enormous 134-inch fan? That gigantic, slow-turning fan is actually one of its environmental secret weapons. A larger fan can move a huge volume of air while spinning relatively slowly, and slower-spinning fan tips generate less noise. So, counterintuitively, the absolute giant of the two is engineered to be remarkably quiet for its size, helping the 777X meet the tightening noise and environmental regulations at the world's busiest airports. The bigger fan also means a higher bypass ratio, close to 10-to-1, the highest GE had ever achieved on a wide-body engine at the time. Higher bypass means more of the thrust comes from that big, efficient, relatively gentle fan rather than the screaming hot core, and that's good for both fuel burn and noise. The Trent XWB attacks the same problem from its own angle. It runs a bypass ratio of around 9.6-to-1, and it uses an ultra-efficient swept fan design specifically shaped for quieter operation. Rolls-Royce engineered it to come in comfortably under noise regulations, and its emissions performance, particularly its nitrogen oxide output, sits well below regulatory requirements. That whole 25% reduction in CO2 we talked about earlier, that's not just a fuel-saving story, it's an environmental one. Less fuel burned means less carbon released, flight after flight after flight. And this matters more every single year, not less. The aviation industry is under enormous and growing pressure to cut its carbon footprint, and engines are the front line of that fight. There's no magic switch that makes a jet clean overnight, so progress comes from exactly this kind of grinding, percent by percent improvement in how much fuel an engine burns. Every fraction of a percent shaved off fuel burn is carbon that never enters the atmosphere, multiplied across millions of flights. The Trent XWB was designed from its very first sketch with that future in mind, and the fact that it can burn a quarter less fuel than the generation before it is, in environmental terms, genuinely significant. It's also why both Rolls-Royce and GE are now working hard to make sure their engines can run on sustainable aviation fuel, the cleaner alternatives that could shrink aviation's footprint even further. The engine of the future doesn't just have to be efficient. It has to be ready for fuels that don't come from the ground. So who wins on noise and the environment? This is genuinely close, and I'll give it the narrowest possible edge to the Trent XWB, but only because its entire design brief was built around minimizing fuel burn and emissions from the ground up, and emissions are increasingly the metric the whole industry is judged on. But make no mistake, the GE9X is a remarkably clean and quiet engine for something that size, and that giant slow fan is a big reason why. Call it a narrow win for the Trent, with real respect for the giant. That nudges the Trent ahead. But the GE9X has a comeback coming, because there's one more thing about these engines we haven't weighed yet. Round 6. Reliability and the long haul of ownership. An engine isn't just bought, it's lived with for decades. And the real cost of an engine isn't just the fuel it burns, it's how often it has to come off the wing for maintenance, how reliably it starts a flight without a hitch, and how long it can fly before it needs major work. This is the unglamorous, deeply important world of time on wing and dispatch reliability, and it's where fortunes are quietly won and lost. The Trent XWB has built a genuinely formidable record here. Consider this: the Trent XWB 84, the version on the A350-900, took 2 years to reach its first million flying hours, but then took only 9 more months to reach its second million. It racked up an extraordinarily high dispatch reliability, the measure of how often an aircraft departs on time without a technical delay, hovering right around 99.9%. And in its early years of service, it went a remarkably long time without an in-flight shutdown at all. By the time the XWB 84 had a decade of service behind it, it had accumulated more than 10 million engine flying hours of real-world experience, and Rolls-Royce points to it as having set new industry benchmarks for maturity and reliability among large aero engines. The higher-thrust Trent XWB 97 has had a tougher road, and I want to be honest about that rather than gloss over it, because the truth is more interesting than the marketing. The -97 runs at higher temperatures to make its extra thrust, and that has created real-world durability challenges, particularly in hot and sandy operating environments. Some airlines operating in harsh climates have publicly grumbled about how often the -97 needs to come in for maintenance, and Rolls-Royce has been working on improving its durability in those tough conditions. So it's not a flawless story. The pursuit of more thrust from the same fan size came with a maintenance cost, and that's a real trade-off worth knowing about. The GE9X, for its part, was designed with maintenance costs squarely in mind. GE's stated goal was to deliver fuel burn dramatically better than the GE90, while keeping maintenance costs comparable to the proven GE90115B. And that comparison matters, because the GE90 family was renowned for its durability and its time on wing. The GE9X inherits that hard-won reliability heritage and adds modern materials designed to last. Of course, the GE9X is a much newer engine in service, so it simply doesn't have the same mountain of accumulated flight hours that the Trent XWB 84 has built up over a decade. It hasn't had as long to prove itself in the unforgiving real world. Reputations in this business are earned over years and millions of hours, not won in a test cell. So who takes round 6? I'm giving this one to the Trent XWB 84 on track record alone, because a decade of service and 99.9% dispatch reliability is an extraordinarily strong, proven record, and proof beats promise. But it's a qualified win, because the -97 variant's durability struggles are a real blemish on the family. And the GE9X carries forward one of the most respected reliability bloodlines in the entire industry. Ask me again in 10 years, and the answer might look very different once the GE9X has its own mountain of hours. So let's tally where we actually stand. Round 1, raw power, went clearly to the GE9X. Round 2, efficiency, went clearly to the Trent. Round 3, core technology, was a beautiful draw. Round 4, bloodlines, another draw. Round 5, noise and environment, a narrow edge to the Trent. Round 6, reliability, a qualified win for the Trent on track record. On a pure points count, the Trent XWB is nudging ahead. But before we get to the round that reframes the entire fight, there's one more angle worth running, and it's the one that actually touches you, personally, the next time you fly. Round 7, what it means for you, the passenger. We've been talking about thrust records and pressure ratios and balance sheets, but let's bring this down to earth, to the human being strapped into seat 34A. Because both of these engines change your flight in ways you probably never noticed. And once you know what to listen and feel for, you'll never experience a long-haul flight quite the same way again. Start with the obvious one, noise inside the cabin. Those huge, slow-turning, high bypass fans we talked about don't just save fuel and please airport regulators. They make the cabin quieter. A more efficient, gentler fan produces less of that exhausting roar that wears you down over a long flight. On a modern A350 or 777X, part of the reason the cabin feels calmer than older jets is the engine philosophy we've been discussing this whole video. The same engineering that lowers the fuel bill also lowers the volume in your headphones. Then there's the bigger, more profound gift these engines give you, and it's this: they've quietly rewritten the map of where you can fly without stopping. Think about it. The reason you can now book a single, non-stop ticket from one side of the world to the other, a flight that simply did not exist a generation ago, is fundamentally because of engines like the Trent XWB. Those 20-hour ultra-long-haul routes connecting distant continents directly. No connection, no layover in some hub airport at 3 in the morning. Those exist because an engine got efficient enough to make them economically possible. Efficiency isn't an abstraction to you. It's the reason a route exists for you to book at all. And from the GE9X side, the passenger benefit is about scale and access. By powering an aircraft that can move huge numbers of people efficiently on the busiest routes, the GE9X helps keep those high-demand flights frequent and, ultimately, helps keep them affordable. The economics of moving more people per flight, more efficiently, ripple all the way down to the price of your ticket. You may never see a GE9X up close, but if you've ever booked a reasonably priced seat on a packed international route, engines like this are part of why that was possible. So who wins round 7, the passenger round? Honestly, you do. The passenger wins no matter which of these engines is hanging off the wing, because both of them, in their own way, are making flying quieter, longer range, and more accessible than it has ever been in history. If I'm forced to pick, I'll lean very slightly toward the Trent XWB again, purely because opening up those brand new ultra-long-haul routes is such a visible, tangible gift to travelers. But the honest answer is that the real winner of this round is everyone who buys a plane ticket. Quick gut check before we go on, drop it in the comments. Have you ever flown on an A350 or a 777? Did you notice how quiet it was? I'm curious how many of you have been carried by one of these engines without even realizing it. So, final tally before the last round. The Trent has been quietly piling up the points on efficiency, on emissions, on reliability, and on that passenger experience. The GE9X has its crushing win on raw power and a share of the draws. But points were never going to settle this, because there's one final round that reframes the entire fight, and it's the one almost everybody forgets to run. Round 8. The mission. This is the round that matters most, and here's why. These two engines were never, ever trying to win the same fight. That's the single biggest thing people miss when they argue about which one is better in some abstract vacuum. You can't crown a winner until you know what game each one was actually built to play. And to understand the game, you have to understand the planes these engines were born to carry, because in the end, an engine is only as meaningful as the aircraft it's bolted to. Let's start with the giant. The GE9X exists for one reason, and one reason only, to power the Boeing 777X. And the 777X is not just any airplane. It is the largest twin-engine passenger aircraft ever developed, period. It's Boeing's next-generation flagship, the successor to the wildly successful original 777, and it's built to carry a huge number of passengers on long, dense, high-demand routes. Picture the busiest international corridors on the planet, the routes where an airline needs to move as many people as humanly possible on a single departure because demand is overwhelming and takeoff slots at the airport are worth their weight in gold. The 777X has some genuinely remarkable features that put the engine's job into perspective. Its wingspan is so enormous, around 64 meters, that the wingtips actually have to fold up after landing so the aircraft can fit at normal airport gates. Those long composite wings generate exceptional lift and improve cruise performance, but they also demand serious thrust to get moving, especially when the aircraft is loaded to its maximum takeoff weight, which can climb above 351,000 kilograms. For a job like that, you need a giant. You need overwhelming, brute force thrust to heave that massive, heavily loaded aircraft into the sky with only 2 engines under the wings. The GE9X isn't enormous because GE was chasing a Guinness record for fun. It's enormous because the mission left no other option. The plane demanded a monster, so GE built a monster. And here's the elegant part. That big, slow-turning fan gives the 777X strong takeoff performance even at heavy weights, better climb performance out of challenging airports, lower fuel consumption on long routes, and reduced noise. The size isn't just for show, it's the answer to a very specific question. Now the Trent XWB. It exists for a fundamentally different mission, attached to a fundamentally different airplane. The Airbus A350 was built around flexibility and efficiency, an aircraft designed to fly an incredibly wide range of routes, including some of the very longest in the world, while sipping fuel the entire way. Where the 777X is about maximum capacity on the busiest corridors, the A350 is about reach and economy, the ability to open up thin, ultra-long routes that wouldn't be profitable with a thirstier aircraft. And here's a concrete, jaw-dropping example of what that mission looks like at its extreme. The higher-thrust Trent XWB 97 is the engine chosen to power what are set to become among the longest scheduled passenger flights ever attempted by anyone. We're talking about ultra-long-haul routes connecting Australia directly to cities like London and New York, flights that will keep passengers in the air for around 20 hours straight, non-stop, no fuel stop, almost an entire day aloft from takeoff to touchdown. The A350-1000 has demonstrated the ability to fly these brutally long missions, and it's the efficiency of the Trent XWB that makes them physically and financially possible. Now think hard about what efficiency means on a mission like that. When you're going to be airborne for 20 hours, fuel efficiency isn't a nice bonus. It's the entire ballgame, the thing that makes the route exist at all. And it compounds in a beautiful, almost poetic way. Every percent of fuel you save is a percent of fuel you don't have to load onto the plane in the first place. Less fuel carried means a lighter aircraft. A lighter aircraft burns even less fuel to move, which means you can carry even less. The savings feed on themselves, snowballing. On a 20-hour flight, that compounding effect is the razor-thin difference between a route that's possible and a route that's pure fantasy. The Trent XWB was built to live right on that edge, and that's why it can do what it does. And notice what this whole thing really is underneath. This isn't just a fight between two engines. It's the latest round in the greatest rivalry in all of aviation. Boeing versus Airbus. The GE9X and the 777X are Boeing's answer. The Trent XWB and the A350 are Airbus's. Two of the most powerful industrial alliances on Earth, each betting on a different vision of the future of long-haul flight. When you look up and see a 777X or an A350 crossing the sky, you're not just seeing an airplane. You're seeing a multi-billion-dollar bet on what the world will need. So look at what we've actually found. The Giant was built to move the maximum number of people on the busiest routes. The efficient one was built to fly the maximum possible distance on the thinnest possible fuel. They are not two rivals fighting over the same trophy. They are champions of two entirely different sports. Asking which is better is a bit like asking whether a sumo wrestler would beat a marathon runner. It depends entirely on what race you're running. Put them in the wrong event and either one looks foolish. Put them in their own event and each is untouchable. And that's exactly why declaring one simple, clean winner is the wrong way to think about this whole thing. But I promised you a verdict at the start of this video, and I'm not going to weasel out of it. So let me actually give you one. Two, in fact, because this fight genuinely has two answers depending on what you're really asking. If the question is, which engine is more impressive as a sheer feat of raw engineering ambition, then the GE9X takes it, no contest. There is something genuinely jaw-dropping about standing in front of an engine whose fan is wider than an entire airliner. An engine that shattered a Guinness World Record. An engine that brushes up against rocket-level thrust and then, in everyday service, holds tens of thousands of pounds of that power in reserve because it'll basically never need it. An engine that survived having its own blades deliberately blown off, that got shaken and frozen and overheated and starved, and passed every single one of those trials. It is, by any honest measurement, the single most powerful commercial jet engine that human beings have ever built. The strongman wins the strongman contest, and he wins it walking away. If your heart races at scale, at ambition, at the sheer audacity of building something that big and making it work flawlessly, the GE9X is your champion, and nobody can take that from it. But if the question is, which engine better represents where aviation is actually heading, then I would hand the trophy to the Trent XWB, and I'd do it without much hesitation. Because here's the uncomfortable truth about modern flight. The future isn't really about being the biggest or the strongest anymore. The era of the giant four-engine jumbo jet, the 747S and the A380S, those magnificent behemoths, is fading into history right in front of us. Airlines around the world are choosing twin-engine aircraft that fly farther on less fuel. They are chasing lower emissions, lower operating costs, longer range, and quieter operations. And efficiency, that quiet, unglamorous, deeply unsexy word is the trophy that everyone in the industry is actually competing for right now. The Trent XWB was purpose-built for that world. It isn't waiting for that future to arrive. It's already living in it, flying it, profiting from it, every single day, on real routes, with real passengers, right now. So who really wins? The giant wins the moment. The efficient one wins the future. And maybe, when you really chew on it, that's the most honest answer there is. The GE9X is the loudest, proudest argument that human engineering can still build something absurdly, gloriously, defiantly massive, just because we can, and because sometimes the mission genuinely demands it. It's a monument to ambition. The Trent XWB is the quiet, patient proof that the smartest engineering isn't always the biggest or the loudest. Sometimes it's the one that does the most with the least. The one that wins not with a roar but with a spreadsheet, not with a record but with a quarter-century of reliable, efficient, profitable flight. Both of these machines are masterpieces, full-blown, no asterisk masterpieces. They just happen to answer two completely different questions about what flight is supposed to be. One asks, how much can we lift? The other asks, how far can we go on how little? And the wonderful thing about aviation in this era is that we don't have to pick just one. We get both. The giant and the genius flying over our heads every day, all over the world. But here's the twist that makes this whole comparison even more fascinating. And it's something I have to mention before we wrap up. Both of these engines, the record-breaking giant and the efficiency champion, might already be looking over their shoulders, because the same company that built the Trent XWB, Rolls-Royce, has been quietly developing something that could leapfrog this entire conversation. It's called the UltraFan, and the philosophy behind it tells you exactly where the industry's head is at. The UltraFan is built around a geared design, a fundamentally different way of letting that big front fan spin at its own optimal speed independently of the turbine driving it. And it's aiming at bypass ratios and efficiency levels that go well beyond what's flying today. Rolls-Royce has talked about the UltraFan family delivering a dramatic fuel efficiency improvement compared to the first generation of Trent engines, on the order of around 25%, and it's been designed to run on 100% sustainable aviation fuel. They even built an entirely new test facility called Testbed 80 to develop it. The UltraFan borrows tricks from both worlds, the ceramic matrix composite components we saw in the GE9X and lightweight composite fan technology, all wrapped around that geared architecture. Notice which direction the future is pointing. Not toward bigger and more powerful for its own sake, toward more efficient, cleaner, smarter. The next great engine isn't trying to break a thrust record, it's trying to break a fuel burn record. And that tells you everything about which of today's two philosophies is winning the long game. So in a strange way, this fight between the biggest and the most efficient already contains its own answer about the future. The giant represents the pinnacle of one era, the era that asked, how much can we build? The efficient one represents the dawn of the next, the era that asks, how little can we burn? And the UltraFan, if it lives up to the promise, is the moment that next era truly takes over. Today's record holder may end up being remembered not as the future of flight, but as the magnificent, unforgettable peak of its past. Now I'm genuinely curious where you land on all this. If you ran an airline tomorrow, if it were your money and your roots and your future on the line, would you bet on the giant or on the efficient one? Would you chase the raw power and the capacity of the GE9X or the relentless, profitable efficiency of the Trent XWB? Drop your answer in the comments. I actually read them, and I love seeing which side people pick and the reasons they give. The arguments down there get surprisingly heated, and honestly, I'm here for it. But if this matchup got your gears turning, you absolutely have to see the next one. Because there's an engine on the horizon, something Rolls-Royce has been quietly testing, that promises to leap right past everything we just talked about. A design that could rewrite this entire comparison and make both of today's champions look like yesterday's news. That video is right here on the screen. Go give it a watch, because if you thought this comparison was wild, what's coming next will genuinely change how you look at every engine on every wing. And if you're not subscribed yet, fix that. Hit the bell so you actually get notified, and I'll see you in the next one.